Yo, what is going on, everyone? Today we have another Rick and Morty video. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and watch till the end.
Welcome back. Settle in. Get comfortable. If you have a blanket nearby, now is a good time to pull it just a little closer. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop. Take a slow breath in and then just let it go. Tonight, we are not going anywhere. We are going to sit together very quietly, and I am going to tell you the entire story of Rick and Morty. From the very beginning, all the way through to where things stand right now. Every secret, every heartbreak, every galaxy-crossing adventure, every quiet moment between a grandfather and his grandson that somehow, against all the noise and chaos, managed to become one of the most emotionally resonant stories in the history of animation. There is nothing you need to do. You do not need to follow closely. You do not need to take notes or memorize anything. So you can close your eyes. You can let your mind wander wherever it wants to go. The words will still find you. The story will still be there, drifting through the dark. And if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of it all, that is perfectly fine. That is, in many ways, the point. Because the best stories are the kind you can sink into completely. The kind that hold you gently even when you are no longer fully awake. So, get comfortable. Let everything else fall away. And let me tell you about a man named Rick Sanchez. About a boy named Morty. About a family that should have fallen apart 100 times over and somehow, against every odd and in defiance of every law of nature and common sense, kept finding its way back together. This is the entire story of Rick and Morty. Part 1. The World of Rick and Morty. An introduction to the infinite. Before we go anywhere, before we step through even a single portal or visit even one alien planet, it helps to understand the kind of universe this story takes place in. Not just the physical universe, but the emotional one. Because Rick and Morty, at its core, is a show about what it feels like to know too much. It is about what happens to a person when they have seen everything the cosmos has to offer, when they have stood at the edge of infinity and stared down into the void. And when that experience has left them not inspired or awed, but deeply, profoundly sad. But before we step into any of that, I want to take a moment here, right now, where you are. Notice the feeling of where your body meets the surface beneath you. Notice how your breathing has probably slowed just slightly since you settled in. You do not need to be anywhere else right now. There is no place you are supposed to be. There is nothing you need to solve or fix or figure out. For the next several hours, you are just here, in the quiet, and I will tell you a story. A long, strange, beautiful story about people who love each other and cannot always say so. About a universe so enormous it should make everything meaningless, but somehow only makes the small moments feel more precious. And about a grandfather and his grandson who keep finding their way back to each other, no matter how many dimensions they tumble through. The show takes place across an infinite multiverse. Infinite in the truest sense of the word. Not just a lot of universes, but genuinely, mathematically, with impossibly infinite ones. Every decision ever made, every path not taken, every coin flip and every crossroads has spawned a new branch of reality. Out there somewhere, there is a version of Earth where humanity never developed language. There is a version where the sun went supernova 3 billion years early. There is a version where every animal on the planet evolved sentient intelligence simultaneously. The multiverse of Rick and Morty is not a concept to be taken lightly. It is the fundamental bedrock of everything that happens in this show, and understanding it changes the way you see every single character. Because here is the thing about living in an infinite multiverse. If everything is possible, then nothing is special. If every version of every choice already exists somewhere, then what is the weight of any individual decision? If you ruin one world, you can simply find a better one. If you lose someone, an infinite number of versions of them exist across the dimensions. If you die, well, there are always more of you somewhere. This is the philosophical trap that Rick Sanchez has fallen into, and fallen into deeply. It is the cold lake he has been swimming in for decades, and it has turned him into someone who is, on the surface, completely untouchable. Nothing gets to Rick. Nothing hurts him. Nothing moves him. Or so he would very much like you to believe. The show lives in the suburbs of this vast, terrifying cosmos. Specifically in the garage of a modest house somewhere in the United States, where a woman named Beth Smith lives with her husband Jerry, her 2 teenage children, Summer and Morty, and the man who has recently moved back into her life after years of unexplained absence, her father, Rick Sanchez. The garage has been converted into a secret laboratory. The driveway occasionally contains a small flying saucer. The family dinners are frequently interrupted by alien threats. And underneath all of it, threaded through every absurd adventure and every deeply uncomfortable family moment, is a story about grief, about abandonment, about the terrifying gap between how much we love someone and how badly we are capable of failing them. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim in December of 2013. Created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. Roiland originally voiced both Rick and Morty, a technical feat that gave the 2 characters a kind of energetic, improvisational quality that became one of the show's most distinctive traits. So Dan Harmon, who had previously created the beloved comedy series Community, brought to the show his signature structural precision. Harmon is famous for understanding story shape in an almost mathematical way, and that sense of deep structural honesty is what gives Rick and Morty its emotional power even when it is being as silly and irreverent as possible. The show was loosely inspired by the relationship between Dr. Emmett Brown and Marty McFly from the Back to the Future films, though it almost immediately transcended that inspiration to become something entirely its own. Where Back to the Future is a warm, nostalgic adventure story, Rick and Morty is something messier, sadder, and ultimately more honest. Dr. Brown and Marty are friends. Rick and Morty are family, which means they love each other in the complicated, sometimes cruel, sometimes deeply tender way that only family can. The world the show builds feels lived in from the very first frame. The Smith house is cluttered and ordinary. Beth is competent and frustrated. Jerry is well-meaning and perpetually embarrassed. Summer is checking her phone, trying to seem unbothered. And Morty is 14 years old, which is to say he is at the most awkward, uncertain, emotionally porous moment a person can exist in. And he has been paired with the most overwhelming person in the entire known universe for his primary adult role model. It is a recipe for chaos. It is also, somehow, a recipe for something genuinely moving. The show's first few episodes establish the tone and the rules with a kind of casual confidence. Rick is drunk constantly. He is condescending to almost everyone. Or he builds extraordinary things in the garage late at night. He takes Morty on adventures that range from mildly dangerous to existentially catastrophic. And Morty follows him because Morty loves him, because Morty is desperate for someone to believe in him, and because somewhere underneath all the bluster and the cruelty, Rick clearly needs him too. That need is the engine of the entire series. Rick will never say it plainly. He will deny it if asked. He will deflect with a joke or a belch or a dismissive wave. But it is there in every episode, in every moment where he could abandon Morty to his fate and instead chooses at great personal cost not to. Rick needs Morty. He needs him in a way that terrifies Rick and that Rick has spent years constructing elaborate psychological defenses against. Because needing someone means being capable of losing them. And Rick has already lost everyone he ever needed. That is the context. That is the world. Quiet in the bedroom upstairs. The hum of machines in the garage below. The smell of something chemical and strange drifting through the vents. Somewhere out there, past the fence and the mailbox and the edge of the atmosphere, an infinite universe is waiting. And in the morning, they will be back. They always come back. But first, sleep. And let me tell you how it all began. Not in the pilot episode, not even in the Season 1 timeline. Let me start at the true beginning, which is the story that took decades to tell. The story of what happened before any of this. The story of how Rick Sanchez became who he is. Part 2. Before everything. The origin of Rick Sanchez, and the loss that started the world. To understand Rick Sanchez, you have to go back, far back. Back past the adventures, past the sarcasm and the drinking, past the citadel and the portal gun and the decades of chaos. You have to go back to a time when Rick was a young man with a wife and a daughter, living a quiet life and making the single most consequential choice of his entire existence. The show kept Rick's origin story shrouded in deliberate mystery for years. Clues were dropped carefully, then immediately questioned. A flashback appeared in one episode that Rick then claimed was entirely fabricated. References were made and then walked back. The writers clearly knew the full truth from early on, but they understood something important. The moment you explain everything about a person, the mystery that made them compelling begins to dissolve. So they protected Rick's backstory the way Rick himself protects his own feelings, by burying it, denying it, and only allowing it to surface piece by piece over years. What we eventually learned, confirmed across multiple seasons, and finally laid out in devastating detail in the Season 5 finale, is this. Rick Sanchez came from Dimension C-137. This is important. Across the multiverse, there are countless versions of Rick, and while they are all brilliant, our Rick, the one we follow, the one who has become both the heart and the problem of everything in this story, is C-137. He is the one who made a specific set of choices in a specific order. He is the one whose story, more than any other Rick's, burns at its center with something irreducible and human. When Rick was a young scientist, he was visited by another version of himself. This other Rick, who would eventually come to be known as Rick Prime, had already cracked the fundamental problem of interdimensional travel. He had built a portal gun. He had seen the multiverse, and seeing it had done to him what seeing the multiverse does to most versions of Rick. It had made him cold, detached, nihilistic. He had shed his family, his emotions, his sense of obligation. He had become what he believed pure intelligence demanded, free of attachment. And he came to our Rick, to Rick C-137, and he made an offer. Come with me. Leave your family. Travel the universe. Become what you were meant to be. Rick said no. This is perhaps the most important single moment in the entire history of the show. Because in that refusal, Rick C-137 revealed something about himself that none of the other Ricks would ever fully understand, and that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose his family. He chose his wife, Diane, and his daughter, Beth. He chose the small, warm, ordinary life over the infinite. He chose love over intelligence. He chose, in the language of the show, to be a person rather than a genius. Rick Prime, insulted and perhaps genuinely baffled by this choice, left. And not long afterward, as Rick C-137 was working in his garage with young Beth nearby and Diane somewhere close, a portal opened in the garage. And through it came a small device. And then it exploded. Diane died. The young version of Beth died. Rick C-137 survived. Allow yourself to sit with that for a moment. The quiet of your room. The warmth of wherever you are resting. And feel very gently what that kind of loss does to a person. Not the sharp, immediate shock of it, but the slow, spreading aftermath. The way it gets into everything. The way every object in the house becomes unbearable. The way every moment of ordinary life that continues after something like that becomes a kind of insult. Because how dare the world keep moving when the center of your world has been erased? Rick did what Rick always does when he feels something too large to contain. He turned it into a project. He taught himself interdimensional travel. He built his own portal gun. He stepped through into the multiverse, and he began killing Ricks. Not randomly, not all of them. He was looking for Rick Prime specifically, the one who had thrown that bomb, the one who had taken everything from him. But the multiverse is vast. And Ricks are slippery, and Rick Prime had spent years building an infrastructure of decoys and misdirections. Every lead Rick followed turned cold. Every face he thought he recognized behind the eyepiece turned out to belong to some other version of himself who was innocent, or at least innocent of this particular crime. He killed dozens, maybe hundreds. Other Ricks who got in his way, who tried to stop him, who had the wrong look in their eye. He became something terrible in those years, a force of grief wearing a scientist's coat, cutting through the dimensions like a blade, looking for the one face he could not find. And somewhere along the way, he stopped finding meaning in the search. The rage cooled, not into peace, but into something worse. Numbness. The kind of exhaustion that sets in when you have been angry for so long that anger itself becomes too heavy to carry. This is when the Citadel happened. The Council of Ricks, a governance body of various Rick versions from across the multiverse who had banded together for mutual protection and resource sharing, had been tracking Rick C-1 during his killing spree. They had tried to stop him. They had failed. Eventually, in a strange reversal, he became their leader, and under his guidance, the Citadel grew into something more elaborate. A full society built around the shared belief that Rick was the smartest being in every dimension he occupied. Rick helped create something called the Central Finite Curve. In the simplest possible terms, this was a boundary drawn around a specific segment of the infinite multiverse, separating all the dimensions where Rick was the smartest person alive from all the dimensions where he was not. A wall of infinite universes, all tailored to Rick's supremacy. It sounds like ego, and it partly was, but it also served a practical purpose. It narrowed the search. It pulled the possible locations of Rick Prime into a smaller space. If Diane existed in a dimension, Rick Prime almost certainly was not there because Rick Prime had abandoned his family. The curve was, among other things, an act of grief architecture. A man using his genius to reshape the geometry of reality so that he could keep hunting for the person who took his wife. Even that eventually failed him. He could not find Rick Prime. He grew tired of the Citadel, of the endless political complexity of governing thousands of versions of himself, more of the absurdity of a free-thinking genius trying to run a committee. He left, he drifted, he drank. He sank deeper into the nihilism that had been growing in him since the bomb went off in the garage. The philosophy of meaninglessness that told him nothing was worth caring about because anything you cared about could be taken away in an instant. And then, at what was probably the lowest point of his life, he crashed his ship into a garage. A specific garage, in a specific dimension. The dimension where Rick Prime had originally come from. The one he had abandoned when he left to travel the multiverse. The dimension where Beth had survived and grown up, had gotten married and had children, and where the father who was supposed to be there for her never came back. Or Rick C-137 arrived in that garage and met an adult Beth who believed herself to be abandoned. And he also met her son, a 14-year-old boy named Morty Smith. Rick did not choose this dimension because of deep emotional planning. He arrived here desperate and without a better option, the way he arrives most places in his life. But something about it worked. Something about this particular Beth and this particular Morty held him here, kept him from crashing out again and drifting to the next dimension. He moved in. He began building things in the garage. He started taking the boy on adventures. And slowly, without ever meaning to, without ever admitting it to himself or anyone else, Rick Sanchez began, for the first time in decades, to love someone again. That is the origin. That is everything. That is the grief and the anger and the loneliness and the complicated, fractured hope that runs underneath every single episode of this show like a current. Rick is not just a drunk scientist with a portal gun. He is a man who lost the people who made him human, who spent years becoming something monstrous in his quest for revenge, who eventually gave up on that quest, and who found himself, almost by accident, at the door of a family that looked like the one he had lost and chose, one more time, to knock. He chose his family again. Even this version that wasn't really his. He chose them. Breathe. Close your eyes for a moment if you would like. He chose his family again. Even this version that wasn't really his. He chose them. Breathe. Close your eyes for a moment if you would like, and when you are ready, so we will go back to the beginning. The morning the show starts, the breakfast table, the garage, the first adventure. And I want to say something before we do. Something about why this particular origin story matters so much to everything that follows. Almost every great story is, at its root, about someone who lost something. Stories are engines of loss and recovery, of rupture and the long, slow attempt at repair. What makes Rick's story unusual is the scale. The loss is infinite, literally, played out across an infinite multiverse. And yet the show insists, over and over, that what matters is not the scale but the quality of the grief. You cannot replace the original. Not with 1,000 versions, not with all the dimensions in existence. Rick C-137 lost Diane. Not any Diane, his Diane. And that specificity is what makes him human. Even when he is doing his best impression of something inhuman. So remember that as we go into the first episodes, remember that everything we are watching, every adventure and every chaos and every magnificent absurdity is in some way downstream of that garage and that bomb and the choice that was made before it all started, the choice to love someone enough to stay. Part 3. Season 1. The Boy, the Genius, and the End of One World. The pilot episode of Rick and Morty begins at 3 in the morning. Rick is drunk, which is not unusual. He has stumbled into Morty's bedroom, which is also not unusual. He is shaking Morty awake in the darkness, breathing something chemical and sharp, mumbling about an adventure he needs Morty for. This, too, is not unusual. What happens next determines the shape of everything. Or what the show establishes immediately is the essential dynamic. Rick is the chaos. Morty is the anchor. Rick wants to do something dangerous and ridiculous and probably world-altering. Morty is frightened, but ultimately unable to say no. Partly because he is 14 and Rick is overwhelming, and partly because somewhere under the fear, Morty genuinely wants to go. Morty is a boy who has always felt small in his life, who has been told by teachers and peers and the general ambient noise of high school that he is not particularly special. And here is his grandfather, who thinks the universe is worth exploring, who thinks Morty specifically is worth bringing along. That is intoxicating in a way that no amount of danger can fully counteract. The first season of Rick and Morty is a kind of orientation. It is the show finding its feet, learning what kind of stories it wants to tell, and introducing all of its major players. And it does all of this with a confidence and a richness that, looking back, is remarkable for a first season of anything. The early episodes set their rhythms deliberately. We meet Summer properly, see her navigate the ordinary cruelties of high school with a defensive confidence that covers a deeper vulnerability the show will spend years uncovering. We see Jerry in the office, working at a marketing agency, quietly brilliant at the specific language of selling things to people and quietly ignored by everyone in his house. We see Beth at the equine surgery center where she operates, brilliant and precise with her hands, her skill going mostly unwitnessed by anyone who could properly appreciate it. The adventures come quickly and they are varied and strange. Rick shrinks Morty down and injects him into a homeless man to help build and manage an enormous theme park that Rick has constructed inside the man's body. A park called Anatomy Park, full of attractions themed around human organs and riddled with the diseases that are ravaging the host. The premise is absurd, the execution is sharp, and the episode establishes something important about how Rick and Morty works. The central concept, no matter how wildly imaginative, is always in service of something emotionally real. The episode is actually about Christmas and about Jerry's desperate need to feel like a good father, and about the way Rick's presence in the house has disrupted the family's sense of its own ordinary rhythms. There is an episode where Rick hooks up the family television to interdimensional cable, allowing them to watch television broadcasts from thousands of alternate realities. Channels show programs that range from deeply strange to deeply wrong, and the family sits on the couch together like people watching a very unusual movie night, reacting to each bizarre fragment of another world's entertainment. The episode is funny, but its understated core is about how the family relates to each other, about the small, ordinary domestic pleasure of watching something together on a couch, and how even that is transformed and complicated by Rick's presence. There is the dog episode, in which Rick builds a helmet to enhance the intelligence of the family's small dog, Snuffles, who then rapidly develops consciousness, language, and, eventually, a plan to liberate all dogs from human oppression. The episode escalates in the way Rick and Morty episodes always escalate, from small and silly to enormous and threatening, and it ends in a surprising place of genuine emotional warmth. Snuffles, who has renamed himself Snowball, leads his dog civilization on a trajectory toward righteous vengeance, and then, when he looks at the family and sees how they love each other and how frightened they are, chooses mercy. He takes his people and leaves for a pocket dimension where dogs can live as they wish. It is played partly as comedy, but there is something in it about the choice between power and compassion that the show will return to again and again. The show also gives us, in this first season, a sequence that introduces one of its most beloved recurring concepts. Mr. A Me-Seeks. The Me-Seeks box is one of Rick's most casual inventions, a small cube with a button. Press the button and a tall, cheerful blue creature materializes with a single purpose: help whoever pressed the button accomplish one task, then cease to exist. The Me-Seeks are designed to want this. They find existence painful. They are not creatures of longevity or leisure. They are creatures of purpose, and when their purpose is completed, they dissolve with what appears to be tremendous relief. Summer wants to be more popular at school. Her Me-Seeks sorts it out efficiently. Beth wants to feel better about herself in her marriage. Her Me-Seeks works through it with her in a kind of intensive coaching session. Jerry, in his way, asks for the most modest thing. He wants to take 2 strokes off his golf game. Jerry Smith, as it turns out, cannot take 2 strokes off his golf game. What follows is a slow catastrophe of accumulated Me-Seeks, each one summoning another to help with the impossible task, each one suffering the agony of continued existence for longer than any Me-Seeks was designed to endure. By the time the situation reaches its peak, there is a small army of blue creatures at a family restaurant, having taken hostages, their cheery expressions curdling into something desperate and wild, all of them focused with the terrible intensity of creatures who were built for a single thing and cannot do it. The resolution involves mayhem and bystander casualties and a golf lesson that goes roughly nowhere. But the episode is remembered, warmly, for introducing a concept that will become part of the show's philosophical vocabulary: the Me-Seeks as a meditation on purpose. Plus on what happens to a being when the thing that gives their existence meaning cannot be achieved. On the horror for something defined entirely by function of being left without one. Then there are the big ones, the episodes that begin to build the architecture of the show's larger story. The first is what fans usually call Cronenberg World, though its proper title is something else entirely. Rick creates a love potion for Morty, who has a desperate crush on a classmate named Jessica and wants her to fall in love with him at a school dance. Rick thinks this is creepy and says so, but he makes the potion anyway, because Rick almost always gives Morty what he wants even when he knows better. The potion works at first, but Jessica happens to have a flu, and when the flu mixes with Rick's compound, thus the potion goes airborne and spreads across the entire school. Everyone becomes obsessively, dangerously in love with Morty, regardless of any other consideration. Rick attempts to fix this. The fix makes it worse. He tries again. Each attempt escalates the mutation until eventually the entire population of Earth has been physically transformed into grotesque hybrid creatures, all still pining desperately for Morty. These are the Cronenbergs, named affectionately after the Canadian filmmaker David Cronenberg, whose films are famous for their imagery of bodies transforming in disturbing ways. The world is beyond saving. So Rick and Morty leave it. This is the first moment in the show where you realize the full weight of what the multiverse means for these characters. They cannot fix their Earth. They have broken it too badly. But there is another dimension, nearly identical to theirs, where Rick and Morty have both just died in a lab accident. Our Rick and Morty travel to that dimension, pull the bodies from the wreckage, and bury them in the backyard. Then they walk inside and just take over. They sit down at the dinner table with this family who thinks they are still their own Rick and Morty, and they carry on. This is not presented as a triumph. The scene where Morty buries his own body in the backyard is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire first season. His hands are shaking. He is looking down at his own face in the dirt. Rick has already moved on because Rick always moves on, because Rick has done things like this before and has learned to keep moving. But Morty has not. Morty sits on the couch afterward and stares at nothing. He cannot process what just happened. He has crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. This is the moment the show tells you. These adventures are not without cost. The damage accumulates, and the person accumulating the most damage is 14 years old. The first season also introduces the show's most important ongoing mythology through two related concepts, the citadel of Ricks and a certain small figure with an eye patch. When multiple Ricks across dimensions are mysteriously murdered, the Transdimensional Council of Ricks, which is the governing body of all Ricks, investigates and accuses Rick C-137, our Rick, of the killings. This is because Rick C-137 is what other Ricks call a renegade. He does not participate in the Citadel, does not attend council meetings, refuses to acknowledge the hierarchy of their shared society. What to the council, his very independence makes him suspicious. They arrest him and bring him before the full council. This sequence introduces the Citadel in all its strange grandeur. A society built entirely of Ricks and Mortys from hundreds of dimensions. The Ricks in charge, the Mortys in supporting roles, everyone moving in the patterns their shared natures demand. The show uses this setting to make an important point about the nature of Rick's genius. Having thousands of the smartest people in multiple universes in one place does not create a utopia. It creates a bureaucracy, a corrupt one at that. Intelligence does not automatically produce wisdom or justice. The Citadel, for all its brilliance, is deeply unfair, deeply stratified, and deeply resistant to questioning its own foundations. The real killer is eventually found. And it turns out to be an evil Rick who has been using a network of tortured Mortys as a cloaking device. Morty leads a rebellion of the trapped Mortys that frees Rick and brings down the evil Rick. The evil Rick is destroyed by the liberated Mortys. And in the aftermath, as everyone takes stock of what happened, a single small detail registers. The evil Rick was being controlled remotely. He was a puppet, not a mastermind. Someone else had been running this whole operation from the inside, hidden in plain sight. As the surviving Mortys are led to refugee ships, one of them quietly removes a small device from behind his ear. A remote control. He looks at the crowd around him, making sure no one notices. He blends back into the mass of identical teenagers. He is just another Morty in a crowd of Mortys. But he is wearing an eye patch. He is Evil Morty, and he will be back. The season ends with a party episode, a beach episode, and enough forward momentum to carry you naturally into the second year of this story. The family is intact, more or less. Rick is still drinking. Morty is still traumatized in ways he is slowly learning not to think about. Beth and Jerry's marriage is still straining under the quiet pressure of Beth's ambition and Jerry's insecurity. Summer is still upstairs on her phone, wondering if anyone in this family notices her. There is also something quietly important in this first season that gets overlooked sometimes in the shadow of the bigger mythology. It is the way Rick and Morty's relationship has already been established in full complexity. Rick is cruel to Morty sometimes, dismissive, impatient, condescending. He calls Morty an idiot. But he uses Morty as a tool, a walking cloaking device, a companion selected partly for practical utility. And yet, there is the scene where Rick almost sacrifices himself to ensure Morty survives an encounter with the Council, and then retreats from that sacrifice the instant he realizes retreating is possible. Not because he does not care, but because being caught caring is the one thing he cannot allow. There is the end of the first episode, where Rick holds Morty and tells him to keep this just between them. The complicity in that moment, the fragile, unspoken tenderness of it. The relationship between them is not simple. It was never meant to be. But it is, from the very beginning, real. And that realness is what keeps Morty going back into the garage, back through the portals, and back into whatever impossible situation Rick has cooked up this time. Not just because he has to, but because somewhere in his 14-year-old heart, Morty understands that this specific old man, this specific drunk genius with his specific grief and his specific love for the universe's worst possible adventures, chose him, came back to this dimension and found him specifically and keeps choosing him over and over, regardless of how he phrases it. That is the whole season in miniature. A family choosing each other imperfectly. An old man and a boy choosing each other specifically. The cosmos enormous and indifferent all around them, and the small warm light of the garage holding steady against it. And somewhere in the multiverse, a small figure with an eye patch is very quietly planning his next move. Part 4, Season 2. Friendships, Federation, and the Night. Everything changed. The second season of Rick and Morty is where the show begins to trust its own depth. Season 1 was excellent, but it sometimes held back, wrapping its emotional content in enough silliness to give the audience an easy exit if the feeling became too intense. Season 2 is more willing to sit with the difficult things. It knows by now that the audience will follow. The season begins with a physics-bending episode in which Rick's failure to properly manage the flow of time means that Rick, Morty, and Summer have been fractionally out of sync with regular time for a period of months. This has created a kind of quantum uncertainty, and as they struggle to collapse their fractured states back into single timelines. Each time they make a decision, they briefly split into multiple versions of themselves. The episode is technically dazzling and genuinely disorienting by design. It is also, in its quieter moments, about the relationship between Rick and Morty and what Rick is actually capable of when Morty's life is on the line. There is a moment in this episode where Morty's timeline begins to collapse catastrophically, and Rick, who has been dismissive and impatient throughout the entire sequence, responds with something immediate and visceral. He risks himself to save Morty. The episode then complicates this by having Rick admit that he calculated a way to save himself, that he was not entirely self-sacrificing, that there was a logic to it. Rick always has an out. He always has an angle. But that first, unmediated response, the movement toward Morty before the calculations kicked in, tells you something true. The season is full of memorable adventures. Rick and Morty visit a planet that has built an entire religion around a piece of Rick's technology, a microverse battery he built that contains an entire civilization inside it. A civilization that generates power for his car by running on exercise wheels. A civilization that developed science and eventually built their own miniature universe to power their technology, creating a strange recursive chain of nested realities, each exploiting the one below. The episode is a satire of both religious dogma and capitalist exploitation, but it lands most powerfully as a meditation on what it means to use people. To build systems that depend on others' labor while keeping them in the dark about the true nature of their situation. The season is full of memorable adventures. Rick and Morty visit a planet that has built an entire religion around a piece of Rick's technology, a microverse battery he built that contains an entire civilization inside it. A civilization that generates power for his car by running on exercise wheels, a civilization that developed science and eventually built their own miniature universe to power their technology, creating a strange recursive chain of nested realities, each exploiting the one below. The episode is a satire of both religious dogma and capitalist exploitation, but it lands most powerfully as a meditation on what it means to use people, to build systems that depend on others' labor while keeping them in the dark about the true nature of their situation. There is also an episode that is arguably the most emotionally devastating thing the show produced in its first 3 seasons, and it almost slips past you because of how it is framed. Rick reconnects with an old lover, a hive mind entity called Unity who can possess and integrate with any sufficiently developed life form. Unity has taken over an entire planet. She is powerful, vast, capable of expressing herself through millions of bodies simultaneously. And she loves Rick in her way, which is complicated and genuine and also deeply unhealthy. Their relationship, the episode makes clear, is one that brings out the worst in both of them. Rick encourages Unity to be more controlling, more expansive, more ruthless in her assimilation. Unity enables Rick's worst behaviors, his drinking, his contempt for others, his refusal to engage with any of the consequences of what he does. They are, together, a system of mutual enabling that would consume both of them if left unchecked. Unity eventually leaves him. She writes him a letter that he finds, and in the aftermath of reading it, he goes to his lab and builds something. What he builds is not explained. What happens next is shown instead of described. Rick nearly does something irreversible. He comes to the edge of it. The episode does not linger. It cuts away at the crucial moment, then cuts back to Rick waking up the next morning as though nothing happened. This episode is one of the first moments the show looks directly at Rick's depression, the real one beneath the performance of it, and does not flinch. It is brief, it is tucked between 2 other storylines, but it is there. And it tells you something about what has been running under everything all along. Rick is not nihilistic because he is wise. He is nihilistic because he is in pain. The philosophy is not a conclusion, it is a symptom. There is the episode about the Vindicators, a superhero team Rick has worked with before and deeply resents. Rick, drunk, has built an elaborate Saw-style death trap inside the Vindicators' headquarters overnight and woken up with no memory of it. Morty has to work through the traps with Rick, who is reconstructing his own drunk logic, trying to figure out what point his inebriated self was trying to make. The episode is furiously funny and deeply uncomfortable. And it ends with Rick's drunk logic having been essentially correct. The Vindicators are hypocrites whose heroism is selective and self-serving. Morty, who had idolized them, has to absorb that disappointment quietly. But the two most important things that happen in Season 2 are both about relationships. Both are about what happens when the people around Rick let him fully into their lives and trust him completely. The first is the slow unraveling of Beth and Jerry's marriage. Season 2 turns the volume up on the cracks in their relationship, which were always visible but had been buffered by the everyday chaos of the family. Jerry is insecure in ways that make him both endearing and exhausting. He loves Beth genuinely and deeply, but expresses that love in ways that feel needy and diminishing to her. Beth, for her part, has built a version of herself entirely around being the daughter of the smartest man in the universe, and Jerry, who is charming and ordinary, cannot compete with that internal benchmark. The show is careful not to make either of them entirely wrong. They are just people who have grown in different directions, who chose each other for reasons that made sense at a specific moment in their lives, and now find themselves slightly misaligned in ways neither of them knows quite how to fix. The second is the wedding. Bird Person is one of Rick's oldest friends. They fought together against the Galactic Federation in years long past, shoulder to shoulder through battles that shaped both of them. Bird Person is everything Rick could have been if grief and bitterness had not done their work. Steady, principled, loyal, capable of genuine warmth. But he is the counterweight to Rick's chaos, and in the Season 2 finale, he is getting married. The wedding is a moment of rare joy for the show. Rick throws the event. The whole family attends. Squanchy, another old friend of Rick's, is there. Chaotic and enthusiastic, his reckless energy filling every corner of the venue. His entire way of being in the world involves inserting his own name into language as a kind of universal verb and noun, squanching everything and everyone. And there is something in his sheer exuberant unreasonableness that makes every room he enters feel slightly brighter. Summer's high school friend Tammy, who has been dating Bird Person, is there in a white dress. Bird Person himself is magnificent, calm and happy in a way he rarely appears. Thus the weight of his dignity somehow amplified by the occasion rather than diminished. There is a moment before the ceremony, easy to miss, where Rick and Bird Person stand together away from the crowd. The show gives them a beat of quiet between old friends. Rick is uncomfortable with the tenderness of it. Bird Person is not. He says something that functions as a kind of warning, delivered with enough warmth that it does not land as ominous until later, that he hopes Rick has found something worth holding on to. He is speaking about himself and Tammy and the life they are building. But Rick hears it differently or pretends not to hear it at all. He deflects. He drinks. He makes a joke. Bird Person watches him for a moment and then turns toward the ceremony. The ceremony proceeds. Tammy walks toward Bird Person. She reaches him. And then she stops, and her expression changes. Tammy reveals herself to be an undercover agent of the Galactic Federation. She has been deep undercover for years. The relationship with Bird Person was not real. All of it was intelligence gathering, preparation for this moment, for the arrest or elimination of Rick Sanchez and anyone connected to him. Federation soldiers pour in from every entrance. Weapons fire. Squanchy undergoes a stunning physical transformation, inflating into a massive, powerful form, throwing himself at the soldiers to give the others time to run. Rick and the family escape, just barely, through a portal. But Bird Person does not escape. Bird Person is shot. He falls at his own wedding, in his wedding clothes, betrayed by the person he loved most. The show does not linger. It moves fast. Rick gets the family to safety, and then, in a moment of cold calculation that reveals how much he has been carrying this alone, he tells them all to go to a specific planet and wait. He makes a choice. He turns himself in to the Galactic Federation. He allows himself to be captured, to be taken away, to be separated from his family and from Morty. He does this, he says, because it is the only way to keep them safe. The season ends there. Rick in chains, the family scattered, the Galactic Federation, which has been a background threat for 2 seasons, finally fully present and victorious, and Bird Person, the most loyal person in Rick's life, gone. The feeling the season leaves you with is not quite despair. It is something more specific than that. It is the feeling of watching someone you love make a sacrifice and knowing they believe it is the right thing to do and not being entirely sure they are wrong. Let the image settle. Rick in chains, but still Rick. Still calculating. Still, even in defeat, somewhere ahead of everyone else in the room. The show has been building, across 2 seasons, a particular kind of dread. Not the jump scare dread of horror, not the action thriller dread of a ticking clock, but the slower, quieter dread of watching someone you care about moving toward a reckoning they cannot escape. Rick has been building something for decades, a life of avoidance and intelligence and carefully maintained distance from anything that could really hurt him. And now the Galactic Federation has him in a cell, and Bird Person is gone, and the family is scattered. And the walls he has been building since the night in the garage, the night he lost Diane, are straining against the pressure from the outside. Something is going to break. The only question is what, and in which direction. Part 5. Season 3. The Jailbreak, the Breakdown, and the Pickle. The Season 3 premiere arrived without announcement on April the Fool's Day of 2017, which was the most on-brand thing the show had ever done. It aired once, then kept replaying for hours on Adult Swim's broadcast. By morning, everyone who cared about Rick and Morty had already seen it, and the fan response was extraordinary. The episode picks up inside a simulated memory environment that the Galactic Federation has built inside Rick's mind. They are trying to extract the secret of how Rick built his portal gun, and how he cracked the mathematics of interdimensional travel. They have created a simulation of Rick's memories and sent him into it, planning to use his own nostalgia and his own past against him. They show him a memory of his origin, of the bomb going off, of losing Diane and Beth, expecting grief to make him vulnerable. Rick, instead, turns this against them completely. He realizes he is in a simulation. He fabricates a memory of an origin story that is plausible enough to fool the Federation's systems, feeding them false information while the simulation uploads what he needs into the Federation's own computer network. He has not been captured. He has walked voluntarily into their headquarters specifically to gain access to their systems. He has been playing several moves ahead, as Rick always is, and the Federation never had a chance. But he hacks the entire Federation economy, crashing their monetary system completely and throwing the organization into chaos. He defeats the Council of Ricks while escaping, settling old scores in a single afternoon. He finds Morty and Summer and brings them home. And he destroys the world they had been living in under Federation occupation, obliterating the Federation's presence on Earth with a precise application of his intelligence and his rage. He arrives home, walks into the kitchen and finds Beth. And in the most casually devastating line in the show's first 3 seasons, he tells her that he is not back for her or for Jerry or for any of the usual things that bring people home. He is there, he says, because of the Szechuan sauce. A dipping sauce that McDonald's made briefly in 1998 to promote a Disney animated film. He claims his entire motivation for the escape was a nostalgia for that specific flavor. The show plays this as a joke. It is also not entirely a joke. It is Rick building a wall in real time, using absurdity to deflect any possibility of genuine emotional acknowledgement. He is home. He has been through something terrible. He has lost Bird Person. He has watched the Federation dismantle everything he built. And rather than let any of that show, he talks about fast food. Season 3 is structured loosely around the dissolution of Beth and Jerry's marriage, which finally happens in the 3rd episode. Jerry, who has been reaching some kind of limit with the way the family dynamic makes him feel inadequate, gives Beth an ultimatum, him or Rick. And Beth, with great pain, chooses Rick. Jerry leaves. The season becomes, in part, about what it looks like for a family to rearrange itself around an absence, and what happens to the individuals within it when the architecture that has been holding them together is suddenly gone. Beth throws herself into her relationship with her father, finding in his approval the validation she has always needed. Summer becomes more independent, more capable, exploring who she is outside the family identity. Morty doubles down on the adventures, seeking in the chaos with Rick the kind of certainty and purpose that his home life can no longer provide. And Rick turns himself into a pickle. The Pickle Rick episode is famous for being the Pickle Rick episode, which sometimes obscures how deeply considered it actually is. Rick transforms himself into a small green pickle. The same morning, Beth, Summer, and Morty are scheduled to attend family therapy. He claims it is a scientific experiment. He is lying. He has engineered the entire situation, including a syringe full of antidote rigged to fall on him after the family leaves, to avoid having to sit in a therapist's office and be asked questions about himself. This goes wrong immediately, as things always go wrong for Pickle Rick, because a cat knocks the syringe down before the timer runs out, and then he gets knocked off his workbench and washed into the sewer by a rain shower. What follows is a sequence that is, depending on your perspective, either the most gloriously excessive action movie parody the show ever produced, or a deeply revealing character study dressed in the clothes of an action movie parody. Pickle Rick, with no arms or legs, he uses his tongue to drive a cockroach by stimulating its brain, builds himself a functional exoskeleton out of rat parts, and eventually fights his way through an entire security compound staffed by international agents, all while becoming something halfway between John Wick and a very small, very angry cucumber. He gets to therapy at the end of the episode, not because he wants to, but because that is where the antidote syringe ended up. He sits in the room. He has fought through sewers and security forces and elaborate assassins. He is covered in something that is definitely not pickle juice. And the therapist, Dr. Wong, looks at him and says what the show has been building to say for the entire episode. She tells Rick that his genius is real, but she tells him that he uses it as an excuse to avoid doing the hard, boring, unglamorous work of being a person. She tells him that turning yourself into a pickle to escape family therapy is in its own way a more extreme commitment than just going to the therapy. That the energy he puts into avoidance could, if redirected, be the energy that heals him. That intelligence is not a substitute for growth. That knowing how everything works does not mean you know how to live. Rick says that was a nice speech. And then he says the therapy is not going to work. And then he tells Morty the reason they are not telling his mother what Dr. Wong said is that if she gets better, she might not need Rick anymore. And that is the only thing he cannot afford. That line, delivered with complete casualness, is one of the most honest things Rick ever says in the entire run of the show. Season 3 also contains the Ricklantis mix-up, one of the most acclaimed individual episodes in the series, and arguably the best episode the show ever produced. While Rick and Morty take an adventure off-screen that we never see, the episode focuses entirely on the Citadel, the society of Ricks and Mortys that Rick helped found and then abandoned. A presidential election is underway. Candidate Morty, a young Morty with an inexplicable confidence and unusual polish, is running against a field of Ricks who view his campaign as either a novelty or a joke. No Morty has ever run for president of the Citadel. No Morty would ever be taken seriously. The episode follows several parallel stories across the Citadel's layers. as a young Morty and a Rick straight out of the academy are partners on their first day as police officers in a precinct that patronizes a destitute section of the city called Mortytown, where Mortys who have been separated from their Ricks live in poverty and neglect. A Rick factory worker who has been making the same wafer for years, day after day, watching a much richer Rick in a display case live out a simulated memory of happiness, finally breaks and takes the rich Rick hostage. A group of young Mortys looking for the mythical Simple Rick's wafer, which supposedly contains a fragment of genuine Rick happiness, wander into increasingly dangerous territory. All of these stories illuminate the same truth. The Citadel is not the meritocracy it presents itself as. Ricks at the top exploit Ricks at the bottom, while everyone exploits the Mortys. The society built by the smartest beings in multiple universes reproduces, with perfect fidelity, every form of inequality and corruption that any human society has ever developed. Intelligence, it turns out, does not protect you from building unjust systems. It might actually make you better at it. And candidate Morty wins the election. Against every prediction, in defiance of every expectation, a Morty becomes the first president of the Citadel of Ricks. The Ricks who opposed him are disposed of with a quiet precision that suggests this was never about the election at all. The election was just one step. As the episode ends, we see who candidate Morty really is. He is not a typical Morty. He has one eye. And he is smiling in a way that does not reach that eye at all. Evil Morty is in charge of the Citadel now, and he is exactly where he has always been trying to go. Season 3 ends with Beth and Jerry reconciling, pulled back together by circumstances that neither of them fully chose and both of them seem somewhere relieved by. Rick, who has been the effective center of the family's gravity all season, finds himself slightly displaced. The structure has shifted, and while Rick has always said he did not need the family, did not need anyone, the tiny flicker in his expression when he realizes the hierarchy has changed tells you something different. Part 6. Season 4. Consequences, Clones, and the Resurrection of Bird Person. By the time Rick and Morty reached its 4th season, or it had become a cultural phenomenon in ways that felt simultaneously appropriate and slightly bewildering. The show's fanbase was enormous and passionate, the merchandise was everywhere, and Pickle Rick had somehow become one of the most recognizable pop culture images of the late 2000s. Szechuan sauce returned briefly to McDonald's menus, which was either a beautiful tribute to the show's cultural reach or a deeply surreal example of art and commerce collapsing into each other, or possibly both at once. Season 4 is the most deliberately self-aware season the show had produced up to that point. It is a season full of episodes that are, in part, about the experience of watching a show that you are aware is aware of you watching it. There is an episode about a story train that physically forces characters into narrative structures, an episode about heists that is a heist of the heist genre, and several episodes that play with the audience's expectations of what kind of episodes Rick and Morty is supposed to produce. But underneath the formal experimentation, Season 4 is doing something important with its characters. Morty, across this season, grows. Not dramatically, not in ways that the show underlines with obvious music and emotional speeches, but Morty becomes, episode by episode, slightly more capable and slightly more haunted. He gets better at handling crises. He makes decisions faster. He argues with Rick less out of fear and more out of genuine conviction. The show frames this ambivalently. Becoming more capable in Rick's world is not straightforwardly good. It means accumulating experience. It means absorbing damage. But the version of Morty who moves with confidence through an alien threat is also the version who has seen enough alien threats to have lost some of his instinctive horror at them. There is an episode where Morty learns that Rick has been maintaining something called a mind blower room. a secret collection of memories that Morty has specifically requested be extracted from his own brain. Not stored for safekeeping. Destroyed. Erased because they were too traumatic to live with. And when a malfunction forces Morty and Summer to view these memories in order to restore Morty to his normal state, what they find is staggering. Not just in quantity, but in the nature of what Morty has needed to forget. Betrayals by people he trusted. Moments of genuine moral horror. Situations where Rick allowed something terrible to happen and Morty was left holding the emotional weight of it. The episode ends with the memories restored and erased again in a final cascade that leaves both Morty and Rick blank and confused on the kitchen floor, Rick's own safety mechanism having activated to protect them both. And Summer, who has seen everything, chooses not to tell them. She puts them back in the couch like children after a nap and waits for the show to go back to normal. The scene is devastating in its quietness. Summer has now seen the full cost of being Morty. She has understood what her brother carries, and she cannot tell him because telling him would mean giving him back all the things he chose, specifically to get rid of. The season's largest ongoing thread involves Beth and the consequences of the choice she made at the end of Season 3. Rick had offered her something extraordinary, the option to have herself cloned, to send a copy into her ordinary life while the real Beth went out into the universe to explore who she actually was outside the context of her family. Beth asked Rick to decide for her. Rick, who could not answer the question of whether he wanted his daughter in his life because the honest answer to that question contained too much pain, cloned her and then deliberately scrambled the two Beths so that neither he nor they would know who was the original. Season 4's finale introduces the consequences of this. Space Beth, who has been out in the universe for a season's worth of story, returns. She is a warrior now, and she has founded a resistance movement against the Galactic Federation. She is wearing her hair differently, and she has a casual competence with weapons that the Beth at home does not possess. She also has a small device in her neck that she has been told will kill her if she returns to Earth. When she confronts Rick and the family back on Earth, the truth gradually surfaces. Earth Beth also has a device in her neck. Rick has been playing both of them against each other, or at least that is how it appears. In the chaos that follows, which involves the new Galactic Federation, the return of Tammy, and the arrival of Bird Person in his new form as Phoenix Person, a mechanized cyborg built from his body by the Federation to serve as their weapon, the family is forced to fight together against a threat that is both military and personal. Chief Phoenix Person is perhaps the most heartbreaking thing Season 4 produces. Bird Person's body reconfigured into a weapon controlled by Federation programming that has overwritten everything that made him who he was. He looks at Rick and does not recognize him. He acts against him without hesitation. And Rick, whose relationship with Bird Person was the closest thing to a genuine peer friendship he had ever had, has to fight back. Rick ultimately defeats Phoenix Person and takes the remains. He does not destroy them. He stores them in his garage, keeping some kind of quiet promise to himself that he will one day fix this, that he will find a way to bring Bird Person back. The season ends with neither Beth knowing which of them is real, neither of them particularly caring in a way that clarifies anything. And Rick alone in the garage with Phoenix Person's broken form and a memory he has chosen to erase about the night he cloned his daughter. And when he watches the memory, he discovers what he did. He scrambled the labels himself. He chose not to know. He is a terrible father, he tells himself in the blue light of the memory projector. He is a terrible father, and he is the smartest man in multiple universes, and he is sitting alone in a garage at 3 in the morning with his dead best friend in pieces on the floor, and he does not know how to be any different. Season 4 is a quiet season in some ways. It does not have the dramatic climax of the Season 2 finale or the structural ambition of the Ricklantis mix-up. But it does something patient and important. It shows us the weight accumulating. It shows us what years of these adventures have done to the people inside them. And it ends in a garage, with a man staring at his own worst qualities and finding no good reason to change. Part 7. Season 5. Memories, Bird Person, and the Truth That Breaks the Universe. Season 5 is the season the show has been building toward since its very first episode. It is the season that finally fills in the spaces, that confirms what was always suspected, that shows us the full shape of Rick's grief and lets us understand, finally, why he is the way he is. It is also the season that brings evil Morty back into the story with a clarity and a purpose that changes everything going forward. But it begins gently. It begins with a neighbor. In the season premiere, an old adversary of Rick's named Mr. Nimbus arrives. Mr. Nimbus is an oceanic ruler, a dramatic and somewhat ridiculous figure who commands the creatures of the sea and who has a history with Rick that predates the show. He has come to renegotiate a treaty. He has also come, as becomes clear in small moments throughout the episode, to tell Rick something uncomfortable. He is the only man, he says, who truly knows Rick, who can see how far he has fallen, who knew him when he was young and still capable of believing the world had something to offer. And then, in a way that is clearly designed to provoke a reaction, he mentions Diane. He says her name. He asks what she would think if she could see Rick now. Rick loses it completely. He shuts the conversation down with aggressive meta-humor, telling Nimbus not to establish canonical backstory in front of him. But the moment has done its work. For viewers paying attention, it has confirmed beyond all reasonable doubt that Diane was real, that she existed, that her absence from Rick's life is a wound he carries in every episode. The season's most emotionally significant episode is the 8th, formerly titled Rick-ternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort. Rick discovers that Bird Person is still alive, preserved somehow in a neural limbo inside the ruins of his own body. He goes into Bird Person's mind to rescue him, entering a dreamscape built from his friend's memories, navigating through the history of their relationship. What he finds there is extraordinary. Years of memories laid out basso like a landscape. The battles they fought together against the Galactic Federation. The camaraderie of their youth, a shared recklessness and conviction that the universe was worth fighting for. And there, among those memories, is something Rick has never fully confronted. Bird Person's feelings for him. Not romantic, specifically, but something that runs very deep. A love built from shared survival, from trust extended repeatedly over years, from the specific bond that forms between people who have seen the worst things the universe has to offer and chosen to walk back toward each other anyway. Rick also encounters in Bird Person's mind a younger version of himself. A Rick from the early days of their friendship, before decades of bitterness had done their full work, before the drinking had deepened into necessity. This young Rick is not innocent exactly, but he is present in a way the current Rick rarely manages. He is someone who has not yet learned to armor himself against everything. The current Rick and his younger self do not get along well. The young Rick is suspicious of what his future self has become. He does not see in this older, heavier, more defended version of himself someone worth becoming. The scene is painful in a specific way that only the best introspection is painful. It tells the truth without flinching. Rick rescues Bird Person. Bird Person, restored, is not exactly the same. Years of trauma have left their mark. He is alive, but changed. He leaves to find his daughter, a child he did not know he had, born from his relationship with Tammy, who is being held by the Federation. Their reunion, for now, is deferred, but Bird Person is alive. The thing in the garage is not debris anymore. It is a friend in progress. The season finale is the true revelation. It is a double-length episode, and it earns every minute. Rick and Morty return to the Citadel, which has rebuilt itself since the events of Season 3 under Evil Morty's presidency. Things have not gone as Evil Morty's campaign rhetoric suggested they would. The inequality that defined the old Citadel has not been addressed. The Morty population, who voted for change, have found that the new administration is not interested in the structural reforms it promised. Evil Morty has been using the Citadel as a tool, not governing it. And then the full scope of Evil Morty's plan becomes visible. He scans Rick's brain. He extracts a complete picture of Rick's history, including the origin story, including the details of how the central finite curve was built and why. And then he uses that information to do something that no one in the Citadel believed was possible. He breaks the wall. He tears a hole in the boundary of the central finite curve and drives through it, leaving behind a singularity that consumes the Citadel and everything in it. Ricks and Mortys die by the hundreds. The society collapses in seconds, and Evil Morty, in his small ship, slides through the hole in reality, leaving the portion of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest person, entering whatever is beyond. Before he goes, he looks back one final time. He has what might be the most important line in the show's entire run. He calls the central finite curve an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. The baby, he says, is Rick. The entire architecture of the Citadel, but the entire structure of this portion of the multiverse has been built to ensure that Rick is always on top, always the smartest, always the exceptional one. And Evil Morty, who has been inside that system, who was shaped by it against his will, is done. He is done being trapped in someone else's story about the universe. He disappears into the wider multiverse. Rick is left stranded, portal gun broken, no way home, with Morty and nothing else. This is also the moment Morty finally sees Rick's full origin. Evil Morty's brain scan has played out everything. The meeting with Rick Prime, the refusal, the bomb, Diane's death, the killing spree, the creation of the Citadel, the years of failed searching, the arrival in Rick Prime's abandoned dimension, the choice to move into the garage and build a life with someone else's family. Our Morty sees all of it. He does not react with anger. He reacts with something more complex than that. He tells Rick that he considers him his grandfather, regardless of the technical complications of dimension and timeline. He means it. Rick, for once, does not deflect. He does not make a joke. He accepts it. They are stranded in the ruins of the Citadel together. The universe is bigger than it was a few hours ago, full of dimensions the Citadel's walls had been keeping them away from. And Rick, for the first time in decades, is not the smartest man in the universe. He is just a man, with his grandson. Figuring out what comes next. Part 8, Season 6. Without the portal gun, closer to each other. Season 6 begins in the wreckage of Season 5's finale. Rick and Morty are floating in what remains of the Citadel, all with Mortytown still intact enough to provide them temporary shelter while they try to figure out how to get home without portal fluid or a working portal gun. The family on Earth is similarly displaced, having been scattered to their dimensions of origin by a failed portal reset that Rick attempted. This initial situation is important for what it establishes. Without portal travel, the show has to slow down. Without the ability to simply open a green glowing door and step into any version of any reality, every problem requires a different kind of effort. Season 6 is, among other things, a season about what the family looks like when Rick cannot solve everything by pulling something out of his coat pocket. The portal reset has sent Rick briefly back to Dimension C-137, his original home, the one where Diane and Beth were killed. Mark the place he has not returned to since the night everything changed, and when he gets there, he discovers what he has been afraid to find. Rick Prime is also back, reset to his own dimension of origin. Rick Prime, the man who took everything, is temporarily findable. Rick C-137 tracks him to his hideout and discovers it is full of decoys, killbots, and traps that make it clear Rick Prime has been preparing for this encounter for years. Rick cannot reach him, not yet, but he knows now that the hunt can resume in a serious way for the first time in decades. The monster that started everything is back in range. The season follows this thread carefully, but it does not make it the only thing. Season 6 is genuinely interested in what happens to the family when things slow down. See, when Jerry stops being purely comedic relief and actually gets to exhibit some capacity for care, when Beth has to be present in her children's lives without the constant science fiction crises giving her an excuse to be distracted, when Summer continues her evolution from phone-absorbed teenager into someone who is becoming, episode by episode, genuinely competent in ways that go far beyond what her family expects of her. There is an episode about body horror and identity that uses parasites as a vehicle to examine whether the self is a fixed thing or a negotiation. There is an episode about mythology and the structures we build to explain things we cannot control. There is an episode that revisits the concept of Rick's nemesis, the villain classes who have defined themselves entirely in opposition to Rick, and interrogates what that kind of negative identity costs a person. But the season's central project is building toward something. Building toward the confrontation. Laying in the emotional infrastructure for what will happen when Rick finally comes face to face with Rick Prime. By the end of Season 6, Rick has been developing the technology to track Rick Prime across the multiverse. He has shared pieces of the mission with Morty, who understands now what they are hunting and why. The family is closer in some ways than they have been since the series began, partly because the ordinary adventures of dimension hopping have been disrupted and they have had to find other ways to spend time together. Rick, unable to use his technology as an emotional avoidance mechanism in quite the same way, has been marginally more present. Or not transformed, not healed, but slightly more there. The season ends with Rick's tracking technology reaching a point of practical use. He has narrowed down Rick Prime's location to a manageable search space. He knows what he is doing next season. He has a direction. And somewhere out there in the wider multiverse beyond the collapsed central finite curve, evil Morty is in his oasis, reading, thinking, building something new. Part 9. Season 7. The Hunt, the Kill, and the Hollow. Morning after Season 7 of Rick and Morty arrived with a significant change that the audience had to absorb before anything else. New voice actors. Justin Roiland, who had originated and performed both Rick and Morty since the show's beginning, was no longer part of the production. Ian Cardone stepped in as Rick, and Harry Belden took on Morty. Yet for many fans, the initial reaction to this change was one of anxiety. The voices of these characters had been so specific, so idiosyncratic, such a fundamental part of how the show felt that replacing them seemed impossible. Within a few episodes, those concerns had largely dissolved. Cardone and Belden did not try to do impressions of Roiland's performances. They brought their own interpretations, grounded in the same characters but animated by a slightly different quality. There was something that might even have been a benefit in the change. Freed from the long-established sonic patterns of the original performances, both characters felt, in some moments, more emotionally immediate. Not better or worse than before. Different. Still Rick. Still Morty. The season opens with an episode that addresses the aftermath of Season 6 developments, the reset portal fluid situation, the family trying to find its footing without constant dimensional adventure as the background noise of their lives. Rick is focused. He has a mission now that has crystallized around something concrete and achievable. The first several episodes of Season 7 are a careful preparation. Rick and Morty hunt through Rick Prime's decoys, working through false leads methodically. The approach is different from Rick's previous hunting, which was driven by raw grief and rage. This time, there is patience. This time, Morty is genuinely involved, not dragged along, but participating as a partner in something they both understand matters enormously. And then episode 5 arrives. Unmortrican is the name of the episode, and it is perhaps the most consequential single episode the show has ever produced. It begins with evil Morty. We see his daily life since he escaped the central finite curve. He has built himself a private retreat in the wider multiverse, a peaceful oasis far from the politics and chaos of the world he left behind. He has books, he has time, he has a kind of careful tranquility. Then Rick and Morty's search for Rick Prime begins reaching into his dimension, disrupting his peace. Annoyed, he finds them and confronts them. What follows is the convergence of every thread the show has been weaving since Season 1. Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty are captured by Rick Prime, who has set a trap precisely because he knew this hunt would eventually narrow down to him. But he brings them to a prison dimension and reveals what he has done across the years. He built a weapon called the Omega device, which has the capacity to erase a person not just from one dimension, but from every dimension simultaneously, removing them entirely from the multiverse. He used this weapon on Diane. Not just Diane in C-137. All Dianes everywhere. He systematically eliminated every version of Rick's wife from every reality in which she existed. He demonstrates this capability by erasing another character while Rick and Morty watch helpless. This revelation is the most fully articulated statement of what Rick Prime represents. He is not just a murderer. He is someone who has decided that the emotional attachments of other people are an offense to him. But he looked at Rick C-137's refusal to leave Diane and decided that the attachment itself was the problem. So he removed it. Not just the one Diane, but all of them. He performed a kind of cosmic surgery on the concept of Rick's love. He made it so that no version of Rick in any corner of any reality would ever be able to find his way back to the woman he chose. The battle that follows is brutal and desperate, and ultimately saved by Evil Morty, who has his own reasons for wanting Rick Prime removed from the board. Not sentimental ones, but strategic ones. Rick Prime, for all his nihilism, represents a particular kind of power that Evil Morty cannot afford to have wandering the multiverse. Evil Morty incapacitates Rick Prime. He disables the Omega device. He leaves Rick with his nemesis tied to a chair and unable to fight back. And he steps away. And Rick beats Rick Prime to death. There is no music in this sequence. No score swelling beneath it. Just the sound of impact and breathing, and Rick Prime talking all the way through, taunting, mocking, saying that Rick has become exactly like him, that the revenge has made them the same, that everything Rick tried to protect himself from has been the thing he was becoming all along. Rick beats him to death anyway. The scene is long and deliberately uncomfortable. It is not triumphant. It is not satisfying in the way revenge fantasies usually are. It is heavy and grey and exhausting. When it is over, Rick goes home. He sits at the dinner table with the family. They are talking, moving through their ordinary evening routines. And the camera holds on Rick's face. He is watching them. They are happy to see him. And gradually, across the dinner, something settles in his expression that is harder to name than grief or relief. It is the look of a man who has achieved the thing he spent decades working toward, and who has discovered that achievement feels like nothing at all. The purpose that had organized his entire life is gone. The monster that gave his pain a direction has been eliminated. And now there is just the kitchen and the family and the question of what comes next. Rick stumbles in the episodes that follow. There are days in the garage staring at nothing. There is more drinking for a while. Morty, who understands something about what his grandfather is experiencing, tries to help by pulling him back into adventures, by offering him the thing that has always been the substitute for feeling. It works sometimes. The adventures are still themselves, strange and funny and occasionally devastating. But Rick is working through something that adventures alone cannot resolve. The rest of Season 7 is the show processing this new emotional landscape. Rick, without his central obsession, is something the show has never examined before. He is slightly looser, slightly more present, if also slightly more lost. Episodes explore the family dynamics in new configurations, Summer getting more to do, Beth navigating her two-version existence with Space Beth, Jerry having a moment of genuine paternal competence that surprises everyone, including himself. The season ends in a thoughtful place. Not resolved exactly, because resolution is not something this show tends toward, but forward-facing. Rick has given himself a new purpose, not revenge, but the simpler and in some ways harder purpose of being here. Being in this dimension, in this garage, in this family. Choosing it not because circumstances have left him no other option, but because when he looks at all the other options, this is the one he keeps coming back to. He chose his family again. The third time, maybe the last time he will need to. Part 10. Season 8 and Forward. The next chapter. Season 8 of Rick and Morty arrived in the spring of 2025, and it continued the emotional work that Season 7 had begun. The show in its 8th year is a fundamentally different thing from the show in its first, not in tone or approach exactly, but in what it knows about its own characters and what it is willing to show the audience about them. The questions that Season 8 begins to explore are, in some ways, the simplest ones. Now what? With Rick Prime dead, with the central finite curve broken, with the family in a configuration that is new and still finding its shape. What kind of stories does Rick and Morty want to tell? The answer seems to be quieter ones in some ways. More personal ones. Adventures that are still vast and strange and scientifically impossible, but that are grounded more firmly in the emotional realities of the people taking them. Rick, now free of the driving obsession that had organized his existence for decades, is genuinely uncertain about his own future in a way he has never allowed himself to be before. The show treats this uncertainty not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity. A man who has been defined by his vengeance, discovering who he is without it is, arguably, more interesting than a man who knows exactly who he is and hates every minute of it. Space. Beth continues to be a significant presence in the family's life, shifting from a disruptive outsider to something like a second center of gravity. The question of which Beth is the original continues to be deliberately unresolved, not because the show has forgotten to answer it, but because the show has decided the more honest answer is that both of them are real. The original/clone distinction, the show seems to be saying, is a category that human experience renders meaningless. Memories, identity, love. These are not things that depend on which sleep pod you were in. Evil Morty, somewhere out beyond the curve, is still out there, still planning, still building something in the dimensions where Rick is not the default winner. The show has not forgotten him. It has simply respected his decision to leave by not rushing to bring him back prematurely. Whatever Evil Morty is constructing will appear when it is ready. Bird Person, restored but changed, is finding his way back to himself. The friendship between him and Rick, which was the longest established and most emotionally significant relationship in Rick's adult life, has been altered by everything that happened. But it has not been broken. Nothing between Bird Person and Rick has ever managed to stay broken. The adventures in Season 8 continue to be the kind of adventures this show does best. The kind that start as one thing and end as something else entirely. The kind that seem like sci-fi premises and reveal themselves to be emotional arguments. The kind that make you laugh out loud and then sit quietly for a moment when the laughter passes because something in the story has lodged itself somewhere you did not expect. There is an episode about summer adventures that becomes about the cost of youth and the particular loneliness of outgrowing a version of yourself. There is an episode about what it means for the family to navigate Easter, of all things, which somehow finds a way to say something genuine about faith and tradition and the way families carry rituals forward even when no one is entirely sure why. There is an episode about cryogenic heists that is really about the danger of letting sleeping things wake up prematurely, a metaphor that operates on at least 3 levels simultaneously. Season 8 does not have the seismic structural revelations of Seasons 5 or 7. But it does not need to. The architecture has been built. The backstory has been filled in. The essential tragedy of Rick Sanchez and the essential hope embodied by Morty have both been articulated as fully as they need to be. What Season 8 is doing is something equally difficult. It is showing us what life looks like on the other side of the major revelations. It is showing us the ordinary, extraordinary life that continues after the epic chapters have closed. And in doing so, it is making the most quietly radical argument the show has ever made. That the thing that comes after revenge, after achievement, after the completion of the long arc is not emptiness. It is just the next morning, which is itself a kind of beginning. Rick wakes up in the morning. He goes to the garage. He builds something. Morty comes to find him. Because Morty always comes to find him. They argue about something small. Then they argue about something bigger. Then one of them opens a portal or climbs into the spaceship or holds up something Rick has built that glows in 7 colors, and they look at each other for a moment in the blue light of whatever impossible adventure is about to begin. And they go. Part 11. The heart of the story. What Rick and Morty is actually about. Now, let the adventures quiet down. Let the portals close and the portal gun cool on the workbench. Let the spaceship settle into the driveway and the garage door roll down. Let the house get quiet, the lights dim one by one, upstairs and down, until there is only the small glow from under Rick's door in the garage and the distant sound of something mechanical humming. Because here, in this last section, I want to tell you not what happened in Rick and Morty, but what it means. What the show, taken whole, is actually saying to the people who have watched it. Rick and Morty is a show about nihilism, but it is not a nihilistic show. This is an important distinction, and it is one the show itself makes carefully in the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does. Rick says that nothing matters. He says it frequently and with great conviction and with the full weight of his intelligence behind it. He says love is a chemical reaction. He says consciousness is an accident. He says the universe is indifferent and the multiverse is infinite, and that individual lives, individual choices, individual relationships have no special significance in a cosmos that contains everything. He makes this argument eloquently and, from a purely logical standpoint, compellingly. And then he spends 30 years hunting through the multiverse for the person who killed his wife. The show understands that Rick's nihilism is not a philosophy. It is a defense. It is the story he tells himself to avoid feeling the full weight of what he has lost and what he has failed to be. The universe is not meaningless to Rick. The universe is overwhelmingly, catastrophically meaningful to Rick, which is precisely why he needs to believe it is not. If it did not matter, it would not hurt. And Rick hurts all the time. Morty is the show's argument against Rick. Not because Morty is always right, or because Morty is a better person, but because Morty keeps feeling things. He keeps being frightened and hopeful and devastated and joyful and overwhelmed. Or he keeps reacting to the universe as though it is real, as though it matters, as though the people in it have genuine weight. And the show consistently frames this not as naivety, but as health, as the correct response to being alive. The relationship between Rick and Morty is the relationship between experience and innocence, between someone who has seen too much and someone who is still seeing it for the first time. But the show does not sentimentalize the innocence or condemn the experience. It holds both in tension, showing us that Rick needs Morty's capacity to feel and Morty needs Rick's capacity to survive, and that neither of them is complete without the other. Beth's story is about the particular damage of being a parent's primary mirror, of defining yourself through someone else's genius rather than your own. Yet her arc across the series is one of the most carefully developed in the show. The slow, painful, imperfect process of separating herself from her father's gravity and finding out what she actually wants, what she actually is when she is not standing in Rick's light. Space. Beth is not a simplification of this arc, even though she could have been. She is a complication of it because the show has the honesty to show that Beth's freedom, when it arrived, was still partly shaped by what she was escaping. You cannot become yourself in pure isolation from your wounds. Jerry, who the show uses most frequently as comedy, carries the most purely human emotional story in the series. He is the person in this family who cannot offer anything spectacular. He cannot invent portals or fight aliens or develop himself into something extraordinary. He can only be present and loving and infuriatingly, earnestly, completely himself. And the show, even as it lets the other characters look down on him, quietly keeps making the case that Jerry's ordinariness is not a flaw. It is a form of bravery. It takes a particular kind of courage to remain earnest in a family that treats earnestness as embarrassing. Summer is about becoming visible, about the specific fury of being the person who was not chosen, who was not picked, who stood at the edge of extraordinary things and had to fight her way in while everyone assumed she was fine out there. Her development from the first season to the 8th is one of the show's quietest accomplishments. A teenager who was background decoration becoming someone whose competence and courage have been built entirely through her own insistence on being there. The Citadel, Evil Morty, Rick Prime. All of these are outward projections of Rick's internal architecture. The Citadel is what happens when intelligence becomes a justification for cruelty. Rick Prime is what Rick might have been if he had chosen the infinite over the family at that early moment, if he had left when asked and let himself become someone who sees people as furniture. Evil Morty is the natural consequence of a system built to keep certain people at the bottom. The inevitable revolutionary, created by the very arrogance he tears down. The show is deeply interested in whether people can change. Not whether they will change, but whether they are capable of it. Rick's arc across 8 seasons is the answer to that question. And it is not a clean or triumphant one. He has changed, he has grown. He is slightly more present, slightly more honest, slightly less defended than the man who moved into that garage years ago. But he is still Rick. He still deflects. He still drinks. He still builds walls in real time whenever something gets too close to the center of him. The show does not promise transformation. It promises something more realistic and more consoling. The possibility of inches. The possibility of slightly less damage, slightly more honesty, slightly closer to the people who matter. Morty is the same. He is not the traumatized, shaking 14-year-old who buried himself in a backyard anymore. But he is not invulnerable, not hardened, not converted to Rick's philosophy of detachment. He is someone who has seen terrible things and is still, somehow, trying to be good. Not because being good is rewarded by the universe, which it is not, but because it is, in the absence of external validation, the choice that feels most like himself. Rick and Morty is a show about grief, ultimately. About what grief does to a person over a very long time. About how grief can hollow you out and fill the hollowness with bitterness if you are not careful. And about how the antidote to that particular kind of destruction is not healing, exactly, because some wounds do not close, but presence. Being present with the people in front of you. Choosing, again and again, the small available warmth over the cold certainty that nothing matters. Rick keeps making that choice. against his own instincts, against his own philosophy, against the weight of everything he has lost and everything he has done. He keeps showing up in the kitchen. Shit, he keeps pulling Morty through portals and complaining all the way through the danger and making sure Morty comes out the other side. He keeps being there. That is the whole story in the end. A man who lost everything and who chose, over and over, against every available argument for doing otherwise, to keep being here, to keep choosing the people in front of him, to keep being, despite every reason not to, somebody's grandfather. And there it is, the whole story. Every dimension, every adventure, every heartbreak and heist and impossible invention. Every moment where the universe tried to unmake the Sanchez-Smith family, and every moment they found their way back together, messier and more complicated, and somehow, impossibly, more themselves. You have been wonderful company tonight. I hope the story found you somewhere soft and warm. I hope it carried you somewhere close to sleep, or further into it, or somewhere in between where stories live best. The garage light is still on. Somewhere in the multiverse, something is always beginning. An adventure is always starting. A portal is always opening onto something stranger and more beautiful and more terrifying than anything you could invent if you tried for 100 years. But for now, the house is quiet. Beth is asleep upstairs. Jerry found his way home again. Summer is in her room, already more capable than anyone gives her credit for. And Morty, 14 or older, always somewhere between frightened and brave, is dreaming about whatever is on the other side of the next door. And Rick is in the garage. He is always in the garage. The lights are on. Something on the workbench is humming. He is building something, or drinking something, or both, which is most of the time both. He is there. That is enough. For tonight, that is everything. Sleep well. If you made it here and this kept you company through the night, consider hitting subscribe. It is free, it takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel grow so we can keep making long-form content like this for as long as you want to listen. Leave a comment if this video helped you sleep, or if you have questions about anything in the story, or if there is another show you would like to spend the night with. We are building something here, one quiet video at a time, and every person who stays is part of that. Sweet dreams. And as someone once said in a garage in the suburbs of a universe far larger than it has any right to be, wooba looba dub dub. Even if it takes a very long time to understand what that actually means.